I think it's time to begin. Welcome, Friends of American Writers. And I see that we have some guests, some spouses, some people from Flossmoor joining us. So welcome to all of you as well. I have a little bit of business that we need to take care of before the program gets started. Typically in April, it's my job to present the new board for the coming year. And as we're not in person, I am going to do this virtually. So, drum roll. Our board for next year is President Tammy Bob, that's me. Vice President Chris Batara, Program Chair Joan Gordon, Secretary Patricia Smart, Treasurer Vivian Mortensen. The Literature Awards chairs are Ida Hagman and Karen Pulver. The Young People's Literature Awards, Angela Gall. Our newsletter and webmaster chair is Karen Baker. The membership chair is Karen Burnett. Luncheon chair, Carol Ashagi. Yearbook, Dale Davison. Revisions, Pat Schneider. Sustaining clubs, Diana Adams. Foundation fund this year will be Karen Burnett, Roberta Gates, and Dory Roskin. Now, typically we would vote as the members would vote to approve the slate. That's really not going to be possible this year. So if any of you have any concerns or questions about the board for next year, don't hesitate to contact me. At this time, I'm going to introduce our program chair, Joan Gordon, who has arranged today's program for us. Joan, take it away.
Hi there. I'm quite familiar with our guest's career, and I can tell you that he got his PhD from the University of Iowa quite a while ago, and with a specialty in Australian literature, which has now broadened to literature written in English, but not American or British. And furthermore, as the years have gone by, he's become interested in all sorts of other things, so that his last book was about, oh, I've frozen. There we go. His last book was about a 17th century utopian novel. And right now he is also working on an Australian Antarctic explorer, a project which I believe means that he will have to go to Australia and specifically to Tasmania, where it happens that one of my best friends lives. So this is his career. He taught English for many years at Long Island University and is now blessedly retired and an emeritus. And the book that he has completed, and which is supposed to come out in July from an Australian publisher, is on the very subject of Major Fitzgerald, who was an officer at Gallipoli, a central event in Australian history and culture. And now I present John Schechter.
Thank you. Thank you, John. I have to say that my entire interest in Australia began at the University of Iowa when I met a girl in class who had just come back from teaching in Australia and convinced me of various things. And she just introduced me. So thank you. It has been a long time, but it's been a long, good time. I'm talking today about events that are formative in the births of two modern nations, Australia, but also Turkey. And I'll be talking about that from both sides. If you're familiar with Gallipoli at all, Americans are familiar through the 1981 movie directed by Peter Weir called Gallipoli, starring Mel Gibson, and I'll be talking about some of the events. It's from a, let's say, particularly Australian nationalist point of view, it's a fairly accurate depiction of what went on at Gallipoli. And I'll be talking about that in a bit. May I have the next slide? Yay. Shameless self-promotion there. It is a book, finally. I also want to mention that it's a book based on privately held documents. The materials that I use and I'm showing today are the property of Fitzgerald's family, his descendants. I use them with their kind permission, but I should say that they are not for public display. They're the private property of the owners. Okay. Next. There he is. This is Major Fitzgerald. The Australian Imperial Force was divided into battalions. That's a battalion is about a thousand, nominally 1,000 persons each, led by a colonel and about somewhere 2 to 4 majors below the colonel. The colonel of the 20th Battalion, John Lamrock, spent much of his time away from the front lines. He was needed at headquarters farther up, and when he wasn't there, he was sick. He had dysentery like almost everyone else at Gallipoli, but it affected him. So much of the time at Gallipoli, the 20th Battalion was led by Richard Francis Fitzgerald. Since it's a formal portrait, this was taken in London in 1916. Let me start with some formal things. He was born in 1880 in Orange, New South Wales. That's a pleasant little country town in an agricultural region. He was commissioned in 1909 in the Australian Army, which means he was 29 at the time, and it's fairly late for a military career to begin. I have no idea what he did before that. That's one of the pleasures of working with this kind of documentary study, that I could probably find out, but I don't actually need to. The war, as it did with many people, as wars do with many people, separated his life from before, during, and after. I'll be talking about during. The book is about during the war. And when he closed the book, he literally closed the book. And began a new life back in Australia after the war. When it began, Fitzgerald was in 1914. Fitzgerald was the duty officer in Albury, New South Wales. He was running kind of a reserve unit, very loosely organized, mostly like a rifle club. But he was on the spot in Albury, New South Wales. So all of his experience is sort of backcountry Australia, not outback, but country towns, small towns. From there, in 1915, he went into the Australian Imperial Force. He had to volunteer from the regular army into the AIF. He went to Egypt. Now this is a kid from the country of New South Wales. Egypt, then to Gallipoli, then back to Egypt. Then to France, the Western Front. After the war, he did not go back to Australia immediately. He stayed in England for a couple of years. He then went to Singapore and tried work as a journalist. Finally went back to Australia, but rather than going to the East Coast, back to New South Wales, he settled in Perth, Western Australia, about as far away from Orange, New South Wales as you can get and still be in Australia. He remarried in 1929. He divorced his first wife in 1921, remarried, I guess before 1929, And I'll be talking about my source, which is his daughter, who was born in 1929 in Perth. He worked as a newspaper editor throughout the 30s and up to the Second World War, when he was called up again and served as an intelligence officer in Melbourne, and died in Victoria, in Heidelberg, Victoria, in 1964. An important thing to note is the hyphen in his name. You'd better get it. You'd better get it right. One of the first things I noticed in going through his materials was how often he corrected the spelling of his name. You spell it as one word, he will get in there with a pen, add the hyphen and the capital G. He does it consistently. Every time he has control over the spelling of his name, the hyphen is there. And that, in fact, is one of the things that first convinced me that I wanted to work with these materials. He is someone who is interested in getting it right. He wants things literally letter perfect. That, I think, it dawned on me that this is a quality you actually want in a commanding officer. You want somebody who's going to let you know what the rules are and that you will, by God, stick to the rules. This is a way of keeping people alive when they're under the terrific pressure of combat. You have to know what other people are doing, what you can expect of them. You have to know the order in which they're going to do things. It's a survival mechanism. Fitzgerald, then it was actually the hyphen that convinced me that of a certain type, a certain hard-ass commander type, that he was the real thing, and somebody I might want to look into. Next slide, please. Backing up a little bit and talking about document studies and archives, this is a postcard. And the overall question is, how do we read the lives of other people? When slim materials come to us, what do we do with them? What do we expect them to do? My training is in literature. And I think once an author releases a poem or a novel, it's fair game for critical interpretation. You can go after things, smash and grab however you want. My duty in literature is to be fair to the text. That's my obligation, be fair to the text that the author has released. Now, that's not necessarily an obligation to the characters, but rather an obligation to the text overall, to the plotting, to the format, to the thematic materials. The characters in a novel are not people, they're devices. Henry James called them masks. You set up masks in a certain order, but then I'm dealing here. This is a postcard from a real person who lived and died, and that's not a professional obligation. That's a kind of ethical obligation to another person. I have to be fair to her. Not necessarily to her writing or to a fictional version of herself, but I have to be fair to that as a living person who wrote this postcard. Now, I don't know if you can see it very clearly. If you could make me smaller and get the image larger, that might be better in a number of ways. What she's writing, thank you. This is Sophie. I have no idea her last name. It's from 1910. It's a postcard from Missoula, Montana. It's a private picture, a personal photo that's been made into a postcard. Now, what strikes me about this, looking at Sophie and her the rest of her life, I don't know, but look how anxious she is. This is a postcard about desire. She wants this house. And my clue to the level of her interest, first of all, she's had a picture taken of the house and had paid to have that made into a postcard that she is now sending to her friend, Mrs. Milton Highland in Ogden, Iowa. I don't know where Ogden is, but the owner wants $6,000. And if you look at how she's written out the price, it's down to the penny. 6,000.00. She's then counting her money as she writes this. She's so excited about writing the house that she barely leaves space for a greeting. The greeting or the sign off is actually a diagonal there on the right. She hasn't left herself. She's talking so much about the house, and that means that paying to make the postcard and even the penny stamp for sending it are matters of connected interest for Sophie. She's not doing this lightly, but she's letting her friend know exactly how much she wants this place. And I find that really interesting. This is a random find from an antiques mall in Des Moines, I think. I like just going through boxes of things and picking out something while Joan and her friend Nancy are going through linens like nobody's business. I often have time to go through a box of postcards for sale. Next slide, please. Joan bought me this. It is a date book diary from the year 1900 by John S. Coryell of Junction City, Kansas. I think she bought it in Lawrence. In 1900, John Coryell is 64 years old. He died in 1904. He had served in the Michigan Infantry in the Civil War. We've got a question. Can we have the slides on full screen? And that would be a lot better, I think, if they can come up. Yes, there. Okay. Yeah, that's good. That's good. Thank you. The diary was given to him by, I think, two of his children who were younger and living at home. He mostly talks about, these are very short entries, they're very typical here. He talks about the weather. He's working in a grain elevator, I think managing a grain elevator. So over on the right, you can see quite a lot of corn come in. It's 24 degrees on the 6th of February. It is very much a day-to-day record of his existence, written though at several levels of himself. He's writing about his business affairs. He's writing about the weather. These are very public events, and then he's writing about his declining health. And a constant theme through this is how awful he feels. He's 64 years old. He's declining clearly. He says he weighs 133 pounds. At the bottom right, 100 years ago today, my father was born. So he's clearly worrying or thinking at least about posterity and how much longer he has. And then this marvelous line in the middle of or at the bottom of the entry for February 6th, "Oh, how tired I am." If you ever wanted to indicate to a reader how you should be taken, that's just a grand line. "Oh, how tired I am." We can all relate to that over the past year. Just sick of it. It's if there's a true line in the diary, it's that one. And maybe the next slide. Okay, back to Fitzgerald. This is a postcard, again, made from a photograph. It shows, I don't know if you can make it out clearly, it's a railway carriage with a gun mounted on it. It's a German battleship gun that was taken off the ship and mounted on a carriage. It could shoot a very heavy explosive shell about 20 miles. Fitzgerald bought the postcard and wrote on the back of it several different things. There's several different levels, several different layers of identity and discourse written on the back of this postcard. One is that the first line, this gun was captured by Australians serving in the British Fourth Army. That's one thing. That's a kind of national assertion. That's pride in his own bunch. He says it was used to shell Amiens. And that's another level of its function, that this thing was deadly. In the pre-atomic age of warfare, this was about an ultimate weapon. It could kill from far away, cause a vast amount of damage. He talks also on the postcard about many people coming out to see it, and you can see in the picture that it's become a tourist attraction. And those are historical, social functions. They are matters of public history. You could call them diachronic events. One thing happens after another, but then there's a very different form of identification on this postcard. He also says in the third line of the postcard, "I saw it." And from there, it goes from witnessing an event, something that happens in public, the capture of the gun, the display of the gun. It goes from that to recording the recorder. It's Fitzgerald recording himself in that place, watching. And very many of the materials, he's not talkative, he's not assertive, but very many of the materials that he writes about or writes notes on, are a separation of the self from the public history. He records the public history, certainly, but then he very often records his own participation or his own observation of events. And that becomes, as you save these documents, as you project their lasting beyond the war, you're going to keep them. What you're doing is projecting, first of all, your survival of the war. The collector, the archivist, the participant can be wiped out pretty much at any moment. So he's projecting by collecting these documents, he is projecting his survival, first of all. And then he's projecting down the years a kind of future self who can pull out these documents in his collection. They're not meant for anyone else. Any more than Coriel's diary and the recording of his illness was meant for anyone else ever to find. In that way, I'm eavesdropping, I'm interceding, I'm picking his pocket, picking the pockets of corpses. It's a really unpleasant image, but that's what you do with an archive. He's projecting his future self in the 30s or 40s or 50s, who can look back on these events and recall not just what happened, but what it felt like to be there. When he says in his diary, which I'll get to in a minute, when he records the troop ship is sailing through the equator, he says, "It's hot." Well, everyone knows it's hot. It's the equator, of course it's hot. You could call up meteorological records. What he means is, I'm hot. And what he means by that is, I'm hot and I'm anxious. And I'm about to go into this massive event in a position of responsibility, and I don't know whether I'm going to be able to carry it off. All he says is, it's hot. But I think under that are layers and layers and layers of meaning to the observer. When he calls that out 30 years later, when he pulls out that diary and looks at the page, it's not just the weather that he's recalling, it's himself at that point. All of the emotions, all of the things he can't discuss at the time, but is feeling all of those come up. There's a Freudian term for it, and I can't remember what it is. But it's specifically that, pulling out a memory and unpacking and unpacking and unpacking. How about the next slide? There it is. This is a document of survival. It's also a record of my source, which is Avon. When I got to Long Island University in 1985, I had a colleague, Avon Bisson, who said to me that her father, I was interested in Australia. She said my father was an officer at Gallipoli. I said, fine. She loaned me what she called his scrapbook, which is a brown plastic photo album wrapped in a towel, stuck in a tote bag. I looked at it in around 1985, 86. It looked interesting. I made some copies of things, but the kids were young. I had babies, and I'm not a military guy at all. I put it away, and then a few years later, looked at those copies I'd made and thought, this guy's real. I need to look at these materials again. I borrowed them from Avon. By that time, digital scanners had been around, and I scanned the whole collection. It's about 70 items, letters, papers, newspaper clippings, a letter from King George, 2 full copies of magazine issues, orders of duty orders, daily orders for the most boring days imaginable on the Western Front, travel records, whatever it was, he kept it, and whatever he kept, he wrote on. He made notes. So I digitized all of that. I'm also, there's also the diary he kept. He kept the diary from the time he left Australia in 1915 in June. Wound it around for another year. That is from June to December of 1915. And then he went back to the page that said January 1st, 1915, relabeled it 1916. Again, a conscious act of record making. It doesn't sound like much, but he had to have planned it in advance. So he kept this diary for a year, finished it. It stops just short of the Battle of the Somme in 1916. I'd love to have his record of that. And did not buy another volume of this date book. I'm also indebted to the National Library of Australia, which has, you have the evidence here, they have a collection called Trove. They have digitized every newspaper in Australia from the 1840s on. So at 2 in the morning in my pajamas with a drink in my hand, I can call up an invitation to Avon's 2nd birthday party in Perth in 1931. She was born in 1929 and died in 2018. It's a marvelous thing to be able to do. I'm also indebted to the National Archive of Australia, which has digitized the service records, the official documents of World War I soldiers. Again, I can call up pretty much anyone I want at any time and look at their official records. The official records are not always complete. What I'm doing now is filling in a whole lot of things that are implied or go unstated in the official version. My feeling is that Fitzgerald was recording a personal version of what he knew would be formative public history in Australia. By the time he got to Gallipoli, Gallipoli was already becoming a myth, and there were not just confirmations of that myth, not just hooray, I was there, but there are also particular things he has to say about being an individual in that place and participating in history. He loves being a major. He loves the army. He's not particularly fond of war. What he really likes is parades and music and snappy uniforms and order. But he's pretty good at war. And when he writes about that, it's again slightly different from the official version. Next slide, please. Let's find Gallipoli. This is the Ottoman Empire, about a quarter of what it was at its height in the 1630s, when Ottoman armies pushed against Vienna, when the Ottoman European Christian front was what's now the border of Hungary and Slovakia. It is much shrunken, which gave the British and French the idea that it was weak. They gave up Libya. Libya was Italian territory by the time World War I began. They had given up Egypt to the British. They had consolidated the empire in what's now basically Turkey and Iraq, Jordan, Syria, Palestine, which is Israel and Palestine now, and as you can see, the coast of what's now Saudi Arabia, Lawrence of Arabia territory. If you look up in the upper left, there's Constantinople, the capital, and to the left of that is a little marker for Gallipoli, which is a peninsula that sticks out and forms one border of the Dardanelles. Now, why the British wanted to attack the Ottomans is not clear. Constantinople it's far away from anywhere that Britain and France were fighting. The Ottomans were on the side of with the Germans and Austria-Hungary. The British main interest is to protect Egypt. They've done that a number of ways. They wanted to keep the canal at all costs, and there was a danger that the Ottomans would attack from the Palestine side. They also had interests in Darfur to the south of Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, and some interest in Libya. So there's a slight rationale to being prepared to defend against Ottoman attack, but why they thought they needed Constantinople is a bit of a problem. One theory is that they intended to hand it over to Russia in order to keep Russia in the war. Another is that simply knocking down one of your enemy's main chess pieces is a good thing to do. Part of it has to do, maybe we could have the next slide and see it more closely. One theory is if you look at the very bottom of the map on the right, the topographical map of the Dardanelles, there's a little triangle that sticks up, and the label, you can't read it here, it's Kumkala. And just to the right of Kumkala is a messy little scratchy area, and that is Troy. One theory is that along with everything else, with fighting a modern war, they were reliving Troy. It was the British Empire saw itself as a revision of the Greek attack on Troy. They attempted, if you look at the larger map, the Dardanelles on the right side, that narrow little strait, they attempted a naval invasion, which was turned back in March of 1915. The British and French fleet was defeated so soundly by the Turks that the university in Çanakkale, which is the main town on the Dardanelles, the main university is known as the 18th of March, 1915 University. It's the only university I know of in the world with a date as its name. Talk about forming modern nations. And so a land offensive is in order. They decide to land on the lower side on this map of the Dardanelles. at places known as Suvla Bay and now as Anzac Cove. They initially, the British decided to land about 25,000 British, Australian, New Zealand, and Indian troops in that space. If you see the next slide, this is what it looks like, or what it looked like in 2010 from the beach. You're landing in this. You're expecting heavily loaded troops to run up these slopes and onward to Constantinople, boys. And it simply didn't work. They thought they were taking the Turks. I remember they thought the Turks were in decay, that they had an inefficient army. Other things that the Turks had were a lot of spies in Cairo and Alexandria. They knew not exactly, but pretty much what the British were up to. 25,000 men landed in this place under Turkish guns. There were very few maps. There had been no air reconnaissance because the British didn't want the Turks to catch on. They were planning a landing. The Turks knew very well what they were doing. The troops, the imperial troops, the British and Australians, moved about 4 miles inland in Gallipoli over the first 3 days, retreated to the beach, and never moved after that. If you picture the D-Day invasion in 1944, never getting off the beach. That's what this was like. It was a time. They pulled back, they dug in, and they fought a war of attrition from April 25th to December 20th, under constant shell fire, constant machine gun fire, trenches so close together that you could basically throw cigarettes back and forth, let alone grenades and other stuff. Next slide, please. This is not an aerial photograph. This is taken from a position that the Turks held. And if you can imagine being up here with artillery and machine guns, this is the advantage they had over the British and Australians on the beach. That body of water to just under my head to the left is Suvla Bay. This is how you fight a war of attrition. In July, they landed several thousand British boys on that beach, so poorly trained that the sergeants on the beach were teaching them how to use their rifles as they tried to march inland. It didn't work.
I'm just,
Oh,
my battery's low.
oh, Joe just came in. In August 1915, the British Empire launched several offenses against the Turks, tried to break out. It was the only time they did it. For example, the Battle of Lone Pine, one particular place, from the 6th to the 10th of August, Australians fought Turkish troops in a space about the size of 4 football fields, 160 by 100 yards. I've seen it. It's like a playing field. With the loss of somewhere between 7,000 and 9,000 people on both sides. They got into trenches that had been roofed over, which meant that the fighting over these 4 days was mostly with clubs and knives and bayonets and hand grenades in the dark. 4 days of that. It's no wonder that Lone Pine is now enshrined in the history of both countries. The movie, the Peter Weir Gallipoli movie, involves an action at a space called the Neck. The Neck is a narrow join between 2 ravines that is 100 feet wide and 160 feet long. The Australian light horse, the 8th and 10th light horse, in August were thrown into that space in several waves. The first wave, as you saw in Gallipoli, the movie, completely machine gunned. So were the second and third. They didn't know what else to do in 1915 but send in the fourth wave. There's a story that a Turkish officer stood up, waved his arms, and shouted, "Stop." And they couldn't do it. So the word stop, dur, is the only word I know in Turkish. By the time Fitzgerald got there, if we could see the next slide, this was famous. This was already part of the myth of Gallipoli. He arrived, I'm speeding up a little bit and finally getting him there on the troop ship called the Barima, which, like everything else in the war, was a repurposed civilian object. It was designed to bring immigrants from the UK to Australia. And here it was bringing Australians to the rescue of the British Empire. When Fitzgerald left Sydney on the 26th of June, he wrote in his diary, "Commencement." It's a common thing to do. He's beginning his diary. If it's a commencement, it's also a deep loss. Commencement, in his term, commemorates that he was leaving a family behind. His wife, Constance, his first wife, not Avon's mother, told him that if he volunteered for the Imperial Force, she would leave him and he would never see his children again. She was, as Avon put it, true to her word. He knew this. They were formally separated at the time he left Australia. And so his writing this very public thing, keeping a picture of the ship and writing commencement the way you would at the beginning of a voyage, also has a very private level of deeply complicated family loss. He knew what he was doing. He knew what he was leaving behind. As he's going off to be a hero, he's also aware that he's abandoning a family. And he did see Constance again. He saw her in court in 1921. But he never did see those children again. The two children of the first marriage. On the Barima, he also took a horse named Quandong, named for an Aboriginal name for a plum tree. Quandong stayed in Egypt while he was in Gallipoli, but Quandong did go to France with Fitzgerald. After the war, they knew that horses were not being taken back to Australia, and so Fitzgerald took Quandong to England, rode her in the Victory Parade down the Mall, and then paid a horse farmer to keep the horse for the rest of her life. Next slide. We've got him in Egypt now, and one of the things that he kept is this letter. Fitzgerald, almost as soon as he got to Egypt, was detailed to take over as commandant of Qasr el-Nil, which is a large military barracks in Cairo. There were several prisoners of war, German prisoners of war, who'd been captured, including Ottmar Freiherr von Gumpenberg, who was a kind of Lawrence of Arabia figure operating in Libya, trying to stir up Libyan locals to attack Egypt from the western side, as the Ottomans were going to attack from the east in a kind of movement. Like Lawrence, Gumpenberg was a flamboyant, proud, strange character, given to all kinds of overblown notions. He offered the local Libyan sheikh 100,000 Mauser rifles, which is about 70,000 more than the guy could use. So he was really building up power in the region and trying to tip things toward Egypt. Got himself captured by the British, and when Fitzgerald took over, was in Qasr el-Nil as a prisoner. Fitzgerald receives this order to hand a letter over to the prisoner, whose name is spelled wrong. Fitzgerald must have liked that. And Fitzgerald, that's the black line of writing right above the fold. Please hand this to Baron von Gumpenberg. And what he's done, you can watch Fitzgerald think here. He's gone back and carried it in, POW, Baron von Gumpenberg. This is a guy from Orange, New South Wales, who's finding himself on a public stage. He's not only face to face with the German enemy, but a German nobleman. And is he up to it? And it's right here, I think, that Fitzgerald enters that international arena, not just with confidence, but with a little bit of swagger, reminding the Baron that he may be Freiherr von Gumpenberg, but he is also POW von Gumpenberg. Ha, ha, ha. That's why you keep a paper like this. You can go back and remember when you're 40 years down the line that you've done this. You've worked at this level. Next slide, please. This is a map of Gallipoli. It was sold as a souvenir in Egypt after everyone had left, after the evacuation. They didn't like the term evacuation. But after the evacuation in December 1915, again, repurposed materials. It was printed by the Nile Mission Press of Cairo, which until then had produced guidebooks for Christian clergymen visiting the Holy Land. So they were used to printing maps. They were used to printing guidebooks. They had the press. And so they sold this. Anzac Panorama, it's called. But if we look at the next slide, we can see that Fitzgerald drew all over it. From the time he arrived on the 22nd of August, he was recording personal information as well as public. On the 22nd of August, the battalions landed in order. This was the second wave of Australians to join. The 18th Battalion got there several hours before Fitzgerald with the 20th. The 18th Battalion was sent immediately into battle, the Battle of Hill 60, if you're keeping track. They were sent uphill. They barely had time to put down their heavy equipment and just grab their rifles. They were sent to Hill 60. 750 of them in the 18th Battalion, and immediately, like within an hour, suffered 383 casualties. Fitzgerald with the 20th landed a few hours later and was immediately sent to Hill 60 with another 350 men. One of the scandals of Hill 60 was that the troops, to keep them moving, were not allowed to load their rifles. They were instructed to use bayonets and hand grenades. The commanders of the 18th Battalion said, "We have no hand grenades and no training." So starting the 23rd of August, having come back down off the hill and not lost too many of his men, Fitzgerald commenced hand grenade training. And he did this himself. This is the commanding major of the battalion, training the men. Normally, this is something you would delegate to the lieutenants, who would then delegate it to the sergeants. This is the major, again, a stickler for the rules, getting that hyphen right, making sure that everyone from the top on down knew how to use hand grenades. So if they ever got into a Hill 60 situation again, they would know what they were doing and what they could expect. This is, again, another matter of keeping people alive by getting it right. Next slide, please. This is an even closer close-up. You can see Russell's Top is where the 20th is assigned. Fitzgerald has sketched in that cliff 200 to 300 feet high. The neck where the 8th and 10th Light Horse were cut up has been printed there. Fitzgerald has added battalion headquarters smashed by shell fire. And then a really important point above the K in Walker's, for Walker's Ridge, our 3 majors killed here. It was decided in late November 1915 that they would indeed evacuate, that they would try to get everybody off the beach. On the 11th of December, Fitzgerald and the 3 other majors of the 20th Battalion were surveying the ground in order to plan the evacuation. A Turkish artillery shell landed in the group and killed 3 of those 4 majors. Fitzgerald was the survivor. He was unscratched. Majors Jenkins, Harkis, and Uther were killed, 2 immediately and 1 died the next day. Not only the shock of those losses, three fellow majors, even though Fitzgerald hated Jenkins, these are your colleagues. They are exactly the same rank. It also left Fitzgerald in undisputed but also unaided command of the 20th Battalion. The work of 4 men was now down on him. What he wrote about this in the diary was this great line: Captain Paul and Lieutenant Barlow badly shaken. Latter, that is Barlow, and Connor, that another lieutenant, near where the shell hit. The captain and the lieutenants are shaken by this event. Not me, not the surviving major, didn't get to me. His job, and here we've got this public and private thing again. The major cannot show emotion. The major has to make sure that the captain and the lieutenants are all right, that they're going to get through it. Whatever he's feeling goes into the diary as that. But he cannot display any kind of personal emotional response. Next slide. I'm speeding up a little here. This is the burial of the 3 majors. It's like hundreds of thousands of other pictures taken during the First World War on all sides. This could be a Russian picture, it could be a Bulgarian picture or an Italian picture. It all looks the same. The dead ones are horizontal and the live ones are standing up. What matters is the reverse, where Fitzgerald has named the names. Everyone who's there. Not just the noble dead, but the witnesses. You see them there on the right. And the mention of there being a firing party. There's going to be a formal gun salute. As if there's not enough rifle fire at Gallipoli, they're going to fire some deliberately. And this is a way of giving order to the events. The list of officers, I think, is really interesting. It goes straight forward to Maya Lin's Vietnam Memorial, where the only thing you can do is name the names. Tell who was there and who was lost. These are the names of the individual people who participated in this very common event, the burial of the dead. It's Maya Lin. It's also, if I can mention it, the Black Lives Matter movement, the slogan, say their names. They know by 1915, there will be Gallipoli monuments all over Australia. There will be war memorials. It's just shocking how big they are and how big the crosses are, the Christian signs of sacrifice. And that's one of the points you can make, is these things are massive. And so the memorials likewise, but also it comes down to, I saw it. I was there. And I took names. I knew the people on either side of me. I knew these dead. These, not the others so much, but these are my people. It's finally decided, the next slide, please. I'm getting there. This is the operation order, printed copy of what was to be expected as the 20th Battalion evacuated. The last line is the numbers must be exact. Well, of course they must be. You're Dick Fitzgerald. They know there will be losses of equipment. The real fear is that the Turks will find out that they are evacuating and launch an attack then. When the remaining Australians on the beach are down to half strength, quarter strength, they could be easily overwhelmed. And so you have to be absolutely silent. You cannot give any indication that there's anything out of the ordinary. It is urgent that they evacuate. They're not going anywhere. They tried in August to bust out, and by December, it's really clear they're not going anywhere. Also from late November on, it is freezing cold. And among the other things that Admiralty Lord Churchill didn't see to was the winter supply of the troops at Gallipoli. They had no winter equipment. The machine guns were freezing. The men were freezing. 10,000 of them had frostbite. Numerous sentries who were not allowed to leave their posts, of course, they'll be shot if they do, stood there and froze to death. Fitzgerald writes in the diary that he spent 25 pounds of his own money buying overcoats for himself and the officers. An unfortunate fact of the military is that the survival of the officers matters more than the survival of the other ranks, the privates. So he saw to it that his staff at least was dressed for the weather. The next one is the next slide, please. This is the evacuation of Gallipoli. This is how they got off, in what order, and who was to lead them. The template itself is probably boilerplate, came down from headquarters, but it's Fitzgerald, the individual who has the responsibility of writing in who is going to lead which group off the beach. That is, there's this public information, which group leaves at 5:30 a.m., but the knowledge that Captain Ferguson will lead that group is personal knowledge of Fitzgerald's through his experience. And so that the middle column where the officers are listed, Barlow is one of them, poor Barlow. Connor is at the bottom, poor Connor, they didn't make it out of France. But these are individuals, again, people he knew, and they go into this public document. These documents, the embarkation order, the operation order, are one-use things. They're meant to be used. Don't work, they're useless. If they do work, they're meant to be crumbled up and left on the beach. Who cares? They did their job. Fitzgerald saw the importance these things would have, and he kept them for the rest of his life. The dark lines are Scotch tape, where he's taped the two things together. Scotch tape, I can tell you, was invented in 1932, and so he's kept these documents that long, and he's actively working to preserve them. Fitzgerald is right at the bottom of this. You can't quite see it. He's written himself in. He is the last Australian to leave an exposed position at Gallipoli. The existential pressure of that is unimaginable. Everyone else is gone. He is not completely alone. There are three other people with him as he's leaving Russell's Top, but he's it. He's at the very peak of this. It's a completely existential moment. Again, the Freudian terms for all of this. He is utterly alone, and at the same time, it is a vice-regal event. He is the representative of the British Empire in that space. There's nothing between him and the king at that point. No wonder you'd keep these documents, you'd keep these events. And the last slide, please. Oh no, this is next to last. This is from a printed account of that last night there in a magazine that appeared in 1932. You can see this is not by Fitzgerald, but by one of the other people at the top at the last. You can see how he's corrected his name. The X is that he's disagreeing with Lieutenant Caddy, who has quoted a message that Fitzgerald left on a dinner table. They left dinner for the Turks. Goodbye, Jackie. We'll see you later. You are a good fighter, but we don't like the company you keep. Fitzgerald's own account, which he wrote later and published under a pseudonym. So no one else has ever found this. This is me. I found this on Trove. Fitzgerald's own account of that last night. The pseudonym, you'll never guess, Kwandong. If Avon hadn't told me the name of the horse, I never would have found it, and no one else ever has. It's Fitzgerald's first-person account of being the last Australian in an exposed position. There's a controversy here that I don't have the time to get into, so maybe we'll look at the last one. There, this is two views of the aftermath of the evacuation. On the right, Fitzgerald was, for his service, was awarded the DSO, the Distinguished Service Order. This is presented at Buckingham Palace by the King, who shakes your hand. As I imagine outside Buckingham Palace, a kind of photo area. Stand just there, gentlemen. Right foot in front of left, lift the left foot. Thank you, gentlemen. Click. This is Fitzgerald in the middle with his Australian slouch hat and a couple famous people on either side of him. This was in a magazine called the British Australasian, widely distributed. It's the kind of official photograph you would expect. And boy, is that a snappy uniform. On the right, this was taken on the island of Lemnos the day after the evacuation. It's a Christmas photograph. It's labeled tall officers. And again, they're all listed by name. These are officers of the 20th Battalion who are above 6 feet 1 inches. Fitzgerald missed the cut. He was 5'10½". But these are tall officers. They're standing in bright sunlight. And the point is they are standing. After months of trench warfare, if you show your head, you're likely to get it blown off. They are standing in the sunlight. Their names are named. And they are looking happy. They're not even armed. They're just standing there looking goofy in the sunlight, and they are proud of themselves. If the failure of the Gallipoli invasion was not the fault of these battalion officers, it was the fault of higher ups. It was the fault of the generals and admirals who planned it. The failure of Gallipoli was not the responsibility of these officers. The success, however, the success of the evacuation was entirely their responsibility, is entirely what they did. And so while I'm not a war guy, I'm not a soldier type, military history is not my field, they did well. They were handed a rotten mess, and they did as well as anybody could be expected to do. It was an amazing feat. It's not anything I would envy participating in. A lot came out of that I disagree with, that I dislike. A fallback of Australian views of themselves as a nation to a military stance, to a combative stance. It's a very masculine event that destroyed a lot of progress that was being made in terms of gender and even in terms of race. It fell back on white male military meanings. But that again is beyond the scope of what Richard Francis Fitzgerald managed to do in his time at Gallipoli. Thank you very much. This has been a delight. I really appreciate the audience and the allowance to go over time. I've talked far too long, but thank you so much.
Well, I would like to thank you for enlightening us about something I'm sure most of us knew very little about, and also the insight into your research and how you interpreted it. I know that, yes, we have gone a little bit over, but if there are any questions, how are we going to do this? Raise your hand.
You can also email Joan. You have her email, and you can send me questions as follow-up later on. if something in the middle of the night comes up.
Okay, well then I will thank you and thank you everyone for attending. And we will see you next month. Bye-bye.